Assalamu alaikum, Sat Sri Akal, Namaste. Welcome to our supporters, families, and friends. My name's Farheen Khan, and this is the Azeeza Show. Last week we had a really great conversation, a very difficult conversation about the sexual violence and the hashtag #MeToo. And our guests Shaila, Kibriya, and Zahra Abbas gave us some insight as to what it feels like and what the challenges are when we're discussing issues of sexual violence in the home. Today, we're here to talk about domestic violence. And with me today are our special guests, Shirley and Priyanka. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Right, so, you know, if we can maybe start the conversation in this way. I know that as we, you know, having worked in the sector for quite some time, we all know that there's many forms of violence that exist. Mm-hmm. Perhaps we can start with, you know, talking about what are some of the forms of violence and perhaps some statistics as well.
Okay, do you want to go?
Sure. Well, there are a lot of forms of violence that disproportionately affect women and girls. Intimate partner or spousal violence, which in some cases leads to femicide, rape and sexual assault. All these things are used as ways to control women and control their sexuality. Sexual harassment in the workplace and also on the streets. Sometimes people will say that, you know, one incident by itself is not that bad when you compare it to other things, but when you think about this as the entire environment going on day after day, it has a huge impact on women's safety and security and their jobs.
Yeah, and when we look at women and work, you talk about domestic workers, you talk about farm workers, you talk about, you know, it's indentured debt. So when we look at it as, you know, the broader forms of violence, we sometimes narrow it to the physical and the sexual. I think we really need to look at the broader spectrum of violence because it takes a lot of psychological, emotional, to get to those physical contacts. It happens long before it becomes physical. And I think if we looked at, you know, reproductive coercion or, you know, infanticide, all of those things are, you know, who is it that gets affected? And it's, you know, primarily women. So again, looking at violence in kind of that broad spectrum and not just looking at it as the physical, emotional. There's also spiritual violence. And, you know, in modern day with so much Islamophobia, there is so much violence that is at a spiritual level. And it is directed a lot at women because it's women who wear the hijab, it's women who wear the niqab. You know, it's not directed at the men who can walk through without having experienced that. So unless they specifically, you know, look or appear. So I think it's looking at that and the layers and layers and layers of violence that women face. And I think for me, looking at sort of the whole picture, and one person can face so many different forms of violence every day. It really, you know, the magnitude of it is quite scary.
And there are other things like forced marriage, FGM, trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation. All these things disproportionately affect women and girls.
Absolutely.
And they can often be intertwined one with the other.
Yeah, and when we talk about statistics, one of the things that I actually made notes about, because I was thinking of numbers, and so we have a population of, you know, 35 million, and they say 67% of Canadians know a woman who has been violated. That's 22 million people.
That's right.
You don't think of it in those numbers, but 22 million people know somebody who's been violated.
No, and it's right. It's right when they say, you know, it's literally your mother, your sister, right? Your aunt, your niece, you know, your partner,
and
your
for
daughter.
Indigenous women, for women of color, for, you know, women who are marginalized, the rates just escalate. So it's looking at, you know, when you talk about femicide, You have between 60 and 70 women killed a year, depends on the year. 6 times as many for Indigenous women. And again, these are the ones that we know about and gets attributed to violence as domestic violence.
Yes.
But there's so many others that go under honor killings or fires or other ways in which they get covered, and they're not actually portrayed under those numbers.
Yeah,
and there are women also who die after years and years of being abused, and it doesn't go down as femicide, but the constant injuries to her body repeatedly. So some of the things don't end up in the statistics. But a number that stood out to me was for last year in Canada, $7.4 billion spent in just dealing with the effects of violence against women. And globally, I mean, it's 1 in 3 women experiences sexual or physical violence. That's not even counting the harassment and the curtailment of women's rights.
That's right. And so Shirley, I know, speaking of femicide, you had I had a chance to speak at your event this year. Thank you so much for inviting me on the December 6th vigil. Can you tell us a little bit about what that vigil was about and what Women Won't Forget is about?
Well, Women Won't Forget started as a grassroots organization after the Montreal massacre. That was in 1989, where a gunman walked into L'École Polytechnique in Montreal, and he started hunting down women and murdering women. He shot 36 people, and 14 women died. So a lot of vigils sprung up across the country, and this was the one that started in Toronto. But right from the start, we realized that I mean, I realized personally that this was connected to the violence that I'd experienced, and that the violence that all women experience. And at the first vigil that we had, we were already speaking about in East Vancouver at that time. There were already 12 women went missing. There were over 60 women missing before there was any investigation done. So the purpose of the vigil is partly to remember the women who've been murdered, but the idea is to bring in activists like yourself and bring in survivors to speak. It's a place where people can go and feel secure and empowered, and hopefully they're going to take that message back into the community, because we're believers in education and activism to change things.
No, and I appreciate you inviting me, because one of the things is that often we, when we have these types of vigils and rallies, we don't see a lot of racialized people of color, of different diverse backgrounds attend. And that's something I think that's really important to our viewers to know, is that, when these types of vigils are happening, when women and people are being remembered for, the loss of their lives, it's essential for us as a community and as individuals to actually go and participate in these things, because the issue is so close to home, right? It's so close to ourselves and our families.
And the women who are murdered every year, it's across the board. All different communities, all different religions, all different ages. And so we need to have that represented in the people who come out to the vigil.
No, and so that's really great to have allies like you. Thank you. And Priyanka, you've been in the shelters, you've worked, in many. Can you maybe give us a little bit of an idea of what that's like, and what it means for women to have to access shelter?
Well, the latest that just numbers-wise, again, I'm putting numbers out there, so you just get a sense of the volume of people. Every night, 6,000 women and children use shelters. And this is just women victims of violence. This is not women who may be homeless. This is not the experience of poverty. This is just victims of violence. And that is a huge number. We are not a big population. And shelters exist mostly in populated areas. They're not in the rural areas, or less and few and far between. So again, for a city woman versus somebody who's in the country, the experience of getting to shelter is very, very different. Toronto, you can take the subway, you can become anonymous in the many people that exist and access one of many shelters. If you live up in Grey Bruce, or a county that's much smaller, there is 1 or 2 shelters. So you're probably at one or the other. So your risk is that much more magnified. Again, and you come from a smaller community, and it could be even in a big city. You could be part of a really small community. Trying to leave and access shelter is near impossible. I think, if we went back to a couple days ago when Oprah was saying, her mother stayed because she had to provide, because she had to do. But it's that loss of a sense of community. And I think last week your guest spoke about, speaking out meant losing community. And so again, when women come into shelter, they've really broken a lot of ties. Not just that they're broken emotionally, but they've also broken a lot of ties before they get there. And the courage and the effort that it takes, and then the burden that's put on them to thrive and to survive and to care for their children, and again, layers and layers of oppression that we begin to put on them, and the expectations of keeping their children safe. Again, why is it only her responsibility? She's not the perpetrator.
That's right.
So you look at all of these issues that women bring, and it's across the board. I don't think I've worked in shelters enough that I haven't met a woman from a certain culture, or from a class, or from an ability. But each one has their individual experience and story. And I think for me, it's about respect. So saying to a woman, we respect the process that you need to follow, because some of them do return, and some of them are able to move forward. But the barriers that keep them in that cycle are phenomenal.
Okay, well, that's great. And I know, working in the shelters, we've worked together even to see some of the women that come through the doors. It's just, it takes so much to come, and it's there's courage when you're dealing with violence, no matter what. Whether you choose to pick up the phone and call a crisis line, or speak out to your family, or whether you silently are dealing with it. It all takes courage, right? To have to deal with the burdens that we're carrying. But coming into shelter is something that certainly I want to talk about a little bit more. So we're just going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back. Okay, welcome back. So we're with the Azeeza Show. I've got my two guests here, Priyanka, Sheth, and Shirley Gillett, and we're talking about domestic violence today. So we were just talking about, with Priyanka here, about the issue of shelters. And I just want, the audience to really understand, and our viewers to know, what is it like? What does it mean for a woman to have to access shelter, and what's that experience like for her?
So I think that shelters have come a long way. We have a long way to go, but I think we've come a long way in that, that first phone call, being able to, find the courage to make that phone call, but know that at the end of that, there is going to be some struggle. So when you come in, you are amongst women that you don't know. You are in a supportive environment, however, with other women who may have experienced your journey similarly, definitely with trained individuals who work towards finding you the best solution for you. Because each one solution is different. So for me, if I was going to go into shelter, I have the option and maybe the means to rent a home or do other things. For somebody else who may need to go on to Ontario Works or something else, the staff will help them get to that point of being able to then look at it within a different kind of budget and means. So looking at it it's an escape, it's a start, and it may need to happen over a couple of times. It may not be right the first time.
Right.
And it's about finding that doorway to be able to find that sort of freedom of self and freedom for the children from the violence, if you have children.
Yeah, absolutely.
Food-wise or clothing-wise, really, if your safety is at risk, you would rather not deal with that and come in, because those things will be taken care of. Again, it may not be ideal, but it is better than the violence you're experiencing.
For sure. And maybe Shirley, if you want to just add, I know, you know, we were talking about safety, right? And the idea that if a woman discloses, I mean, there's a, from what I understand, there's, you know, the risk of fatality increases significantly when a woman chooses to leave, but also, you know, when she discloses that to her partner. So often we tell our women not to necessarily do that, and, you know, and that there's a whole process in terms of, you know, even what they should or should not do and what kind of supports they need, right, Shirley? So
yeah, I would suggest to any woman to call the Assaulted Women's Helpline. I mean, you can get help in over 100 languages there, because violence almost always escalates in these cases, and you need to have a safety plan. And when you're working with someone who has experience like yourself in shelters, they will help you think of all the things that you might not think of for your safety. That's really important, because there are a lot of barriers for women coming forward. I mean, one is the police, especially in cases, the Globe and Mail had that series Unfounded, especially in cases of rape, where they're just turned away. That keeps a lot of women from coming forward. And then we've seen a number of cases, and this is where the court systems come in the past couple of months. There's been a number of cases of little girls, and in some cases their mothers, being murdered by the violent father. And in every single one of these cases, there was incident after incident after incident. This didn't just come out of nowhere. And in one case, the judge was ordering the daughters to be sent to live with the father, even though he was under investigation for sexually abusing them, even though he'd been violent with his mother. I mean, this could have been prevented. And in another case, it was his fourth breach of a protection order. I mean, why wasn't something done on the first one? So when women see things like this frightens them. I'll go forward, and nothing would happen. I won't get my safety. But I really encourage them to still make that step, but make it with support. Get a safety plan. Find a community where you can have some dialogue. Like I run a support group for survivors of and those at risk of forced marriage and FGM. There are groups throughout the city, and if you can't physically get to a group, there are Facebook groups that are secret groups that are great, and you need the support from the system. That's where the Assaulted Women's Helpline comes in, and you need support from your peers. And those are the things that will help keep you safe.
And I think one of your, again, I'm going to go back to your last show, one of the guests talked about, you know, you may not find the support in your community, but come into a community that's supportive.
Yes.
And I think that sometimes that is a huge fear of giving up your roots, your community. And we've all done it in different ways to be able to do this work. You know, we've had to eliminate people from our lives. We've had to walk away from situations. And I think that just letting a woman know that you respect her and you will honor her for her choice, whether it is to leave, stay, or otherwise, but you can help her with a plan that's best for her. And whether it's through, you know, different helplines, or whether it's through the shelter, they have their own crisis lines. But again, you know, what is her primary safety? If we were to tell a friend, what would we be saying? You know, think of it in a broader sense. You might be more advice giving to your friend, but with somebody who you don't really know the risk of lethality in that situation. My conversation with her would be more about what is it that you want? Because she may want to stay and just experience violence less. So, you know, it could be about those conversations and how you help those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of the conversation, right? It's like, you know, sometimes women don't want to necessarily leave the situation. They're just hoping that violence is eliminated. And, you know, calling a shelter or an assaulted women's helpline doesn't mean that you're absolutely going to leave your family and move into shelter. You know, the individuals that are on the line are actually experts in their fields and are going to walk you through and actually assess your level of safety, right? To determine whether or not that's even an option. You know, and women can still access, you know, the phone lines. They're all anonymous, right? There's no...
And the outreach teams.
Yeah, the outreach
teams. A lot of
teams,
shelters have outreach services that women can access.
And what would they access from there?
Even if it's to get a group support, even if it's to feel for one evening that you are free from violence. If it's to feel for one evening that somebody else has heard your story. Maybe for the 1 hour of the one evening, you have somebody taking care of your child and you're not being beaten because you're not taking care of your own child. Or you're able to have a cup of tea that somebody else serves you. All those little things, we do forget how much it means to women, and that's what I found in shelter, is, you know, watching women broken coming in and then finding that immense strength to just fly. But also watching women who aren't able to take that, and then learning how to work through and support them without it becoming overwhelming.
That's what I find in the survivors group. It's just, I mean, the women come from different backgrounds, different religions, different experiences. But when they come there, all the other women in the group understand. They don't have to explain everything. And so the distance that they have from their families or other individuals in their communities, you know, they don't have to go into long explanations. And it's just, it's a real sense of peace to just be with other women who have experienced what you've experienced, who completely understand, and a lot of them form really close friendships because of that go on.
Yeah, and when we talk about, again, when women come into shelter, they're bringing their children with them if they have children. And sometimes the children are boys. So there is that conversation that's happening with young boys too about a fact of respect and safety and acceptance. So it's not just that you're working with mom, but you're working with the broader, the communities to be, if you look at it that way. So you know, you may not want to do it for you, but I find often women will do it for their children.
For their children, and it's one of those things, right? Like, I mean, we try so wholeheartedly to make things work. Women, you know, we try to overlook things so much. We try to piece together things that are broken, hoping that, you know, somehow or another it'll be fixed and things will be better. But I think sometimes it's just, you know, there's that line where once it's like, you know, crossed, then we just have to make that decision, right? And sometimes you're right, it's not just about us, it's about our children, it's about what kind of future we want for them. You know, we've seen so many households where mom's dealing with all these things and the kids are saying, you know, like, you can leave, like, we'll support you, just get out, right? Well, I can't, I love him too much, and he's not a bad person, and he'll be better, you know, I know he will, right? It's all that sort of hope that kind of keeps us there. But sometimes it's looking beyond that as well and saying, well, how can we make this a better situation?
They often don't realize how much this is affecting the children. And when children are in a household where if they're experience violence, even if the children are not abused, watching their mother being abused, this does terrible things. I mean, they have twice the rate of having psychiatric disorders later. This is having a big effect on the children. And I think, you know, we need to recognize that, because often that is the crisis point that causes a woman to leave. One woman was saying to me, she just had figured this is her life. There's nothing she could do. But when she realized she was pregnant, it was like, okay, I have to get out of here. I can't raise a child in this.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think the Japanese have a really sweet proverb, right? That when something is broken, they use gold to fix the cracks, to make it whole again. And I think if we look at services as that gold that will fix the cracks, and look at, you know, each individual step that the woman takes is that little bit of gold that she's adding to her crack or her sort of brokenness to be able to be whole again. So you'll never be perfect, because you will always hold those feelings and emotions and, you know, what you've been through. But what you have done is help bind it together differently.
Well, that's actually a really great analogy. So thank you for sharing that. So we're almost out of time. So just want to ask if there's any last minute thoughts that you have that you'd like to share?
Well, there's one thing that I think is really important, and that is that everybody in the audience can have a role to play in ending violence against women. Because if you think about it, every time somebody tells a rape joke, every time somebody dismisses a survivor and blames the victim, you can be sure that in that group there are several women who have been through violence, and you can also be sure that there's at least one man who is an abuser. So men, women, elderly people, teenagers, it doesn't matter who you are, if you can shut down those conversations, turn them around every single time, that will do more than anything to actually to end in violence.
Yeah, and for me, it's if all you can do is listen, then give somebody that ear, because that could be the difference between living and dying.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a really great conversation. You know, it's been a heavy one, but it's very necessary, and I really thank both of you for doing all the work that you do in the community. And I know that you've both, you know, truly affected positively many women and have held many of their stories. So thanks for all that you do.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. And thank you to our viewers for watching today. We look forward to seeing you next week. So if we can think of anything to take away from today, it's just to remember that violence is a lot closer than we think. It's in our homes, it's in our families, it's in our communities, and it's our job to make sure that we do our best to address violence and that we support those that come forward with this issue. Thank you so much, and see you next week.